And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Gordon Chang, columnist at Forbes.com. And here in studio, Jorge, Heine, CG Chair of Global Governance at Wilfrid Laurier University. Ananya Mukherjee, Professor of Political Science and South Asian Studies at York University. And Alexandroff, co-director of the G20 Research Group at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the U of T. And it's good to have everybody both around the table here. And Gordon, virtually, I guess, on the line from Washington. Nice to see you again. And why don't I start with you? Tell me how important you think it is that the three emerging powers that we're talking about tonight, Brazil, India, China, how important to the success of international efforts on global issues and the economy going forward are they? And I see you pointing to your earpiece, which means, Gordon, I guess you're not hearing me. So I'm going to start back here in studio. Sure. Alan, same question. How important?
Oh, I think it's very important. I mean, this is really the first global governance institution which brings together the large emerging market countries and the traditional countries, traditional powers, the United States, et cetera, and the G7. And so that it really, it's interesting because we've done some work with the UN, and the UN never really worried about the G7 because that was just the club of the rich, the traditional powers. They could kind of ignore it. They don't ignore the G20. It's quite a different animal.
Ananya, how would you answer the question?
Well, it's obviously very important. There's no question about that if you consider it's 1/3 of all humanity, almost, and then the very substantial portion of the global workforce. And given what is going on in the aftermath of the financial crisis, this is the moment when these countries and the people of these countries should be represented in international bodies.
Jorge?
Yes, what I find most interesting about this is the emerging countries engaging the northern countries, the industrialized countries, in a non-antagonistic way. If you look back at the 70s and 80s and the discussions around the new international economic order, it was a very antagonistic relationship that didn't work. In the end, nothing happened. This is engagement. And what I find most appealing of it is this: it works on both sides. And you haven't seen great resistance on the part of the countries of the North. Quite the contrary. The original meeting was called by President Bush in Washington on 15 November 2008. So that, I think, is very fruitful.
Okay, I think we're back in business in Washington. So let me give Gordon Chang a chance to speak to that question about how you gauge the importance of these three emerging countries, Brazil, India, China, to the progress potentially to be made on global issues and the economy.
Well, I think that it's important, of course, because they are big economies. But the real question is the G20 going to work? We've had 3 G20 summits up to now and really have produced very little. We've got another one where probably there's not going to be consensus on issues. So I think the important thing is really going to be whether all of these countries in the G20 can work with each other. And if they can't, then this organization or this grouping really doesn't have a purpose.
Okay, we're going to call this next graphic that we're putting up a brick short of a load, which is a cute way of asking whether or not Russia's still relevant here. You know the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. People have always, in the international arena, referred to these 4 countries together as in the emerging BRIC nations. But Alan, I wonder if the R in the BRIC still belongs there.
Well, I mean, in some sense, on the economic side, probably the answer is no. But, the Russians have kind of been in the middle of this, right? They were brought into the G7 to become the G8. And they also have, close relations with a number of these large emerging market countries. And, now for the last couple of years, they've actually met together on an annual basis. And it's interesting because I talked to some of my friends in Brazil who, after the emergence of the G20, leaders in Pittsburgh the BRICS, you don't need that institution anymore. And yet, they've now said after these meetings that, in fact, they think the BRICS do have a role. Leaders getting together from Brazil, Russia, India, and China getting together, they think, has purpose.
But in terms of economy, Jorge, does Russia still belong on that list?
Well, let me say the following. If you look at what the Russian economy looked like in 1999 and what it looks like today, it's a very different picture. Per capita income has increased almost by 3 times. So there's been a real turnaround in the Russian economy. It's not in the same league in terms of size of what some of these others are, but it has come back. And the other thing that is important to keep in mind is that Russia comes from a great power tradition, so it knows what it is to pull its way around. And that is something that must be considered and respected.
Oh, no, that's all true, but you know, this is also a country unlike India, unlike Brazil, doesn't have growth rates of 10%. It's not firing on all cylinders nowadays.
Well, that's the point that, you know, points to the problem of G20. Unless it's a great, unless you have those sound bites like outsourcing or the great manufacturing boom, nobody really cares about, unless it's a market or a supplier. People don't care if it belongs to the club. I mean, Russia has, in addition to its growth, it has huge problems of mortality and so on. And who is interested in that? And I think this points to a deeper problem with why the G20 has been constructed and what it's going to do.
Gordon, does that R still belong in the BRIC?
I don't really think so. You've got 3 countries that are firing on all cylinders, as you say. Russia, you know, had really good growth rates, but it was because it's a hydrocarbon superpower. You know, price of gas and oil falls, you know, the Russian economy falls. And that's what we saw in the last couple of years. So, yeah, I guess you could say it makes it nice to have Russia there, but it really doesn't look like the other 3. It just now looks like a very artificial grouping.
Well, I happen to know Alan Alexandroff's travel itinerary for most of the last several years. Alan, how many trips to China have you taken?
Oh, probably in the last year, 5, 6, 7, something like that.
And in the last,
None.
say, 5 years?
Oh, well over 20. But
And you're anticipating my next question, which is how many times you've gone to Russia?
None.
Right. What does that say?
Well, I mean, I think it is in some ways a slight outlier. But I would say this. We've always looked at this question of, you know, the group, the informal network, the informal leaders clubs, whether it's G7, G8, G20, however, even BRICS, as principally around economic power. And there's no doubt in that sense, I think Russia, our colleague in Washington is right, really doesn't fit in, notwithstanding the hydrocarbon issue. But there is a secondary element of kind of leverage, political leverage or diplomatic leverage. And in that sense, I think Jorge is right. The Russians know how to play that kind of game. It's more than a game, but how to be part of that. And people recognize it as having a certain amount of diplomatic leverage. And I think that's part of the reason why, certainly that was part of the reason why it's there.
Is that still the case, that the world still sees Russia as a major player because of its 1,000 years of considering itself a world power?
You know, until 20 years ago, it was one of the 2 superpowers. So it seems to me we mustn't exaggerate these things. Come on. Spain is now the curious condition of being permanent guest at the G20 meeting, and it's almost broke. Should it therefore be taken out? I mean, the economies go up and down, but you know, countries have certain standing, and that should be considered.
That should be considered. Okay, let's read something here from the Associated Press that was published just today, proving that flexibility is a two-way street. The Chinese yuan edged lower against the U.S. dollar in spot trading Tuesday, a day after surging to a new high following the central bank's decision to let the currency trade in a wider range. The People's Bank of China announced Saturday plans to allow greater flexibility in exchange rates, moving to blunt accusations that its current policies keep the yuan undervalued against the dollar, giving Chinese exporters an unfair advantage in overseas markets. Alan, again to you first here. China's desire to keep its currency low against other world currencies has been seen as a major issue going into the G20 meetings. Obviously, the American government, I guess foremost in the world, is complaining that the Chinese are you know, rigging the system in a sense by doing this. How much has this weekend's agenda been changed by the fact that the Chinese have, in essence, put out this olive branch?
But if you look at the meeting between the Chinese and the United States government, what's called the SNED, right? That annual meeting. In fact, the Americans had begun to ease off, at least the administration had begun to ease off. Now, the trade figures, I think, did put some pressure on the United States to raise the question, partly because of Congress. I think the reality is they've taken, the Chinese announcement took some of the heat out of that. And I think it was, they did that on purpose, obviously. It wasn't just by chance they decided to make the announcement.
Gordon, does this take that currency issue and the fluctuation thereof off the table?
Well, I think that for the G20 meeting in Toronto, yes, it's not going to be that big a deal. But in Washington, where I'm sitting right now, it is an enormous deal, because what happened on Monday and Tuesday's trading is basically it was rig trading. Reuters has reported that the Chinese banks were ordered to buy dollars. People in this town know about that. Senators Schumer and Graham, who have their currency bill, are going to go for it. They've got the votes to pass it and maybe even override a veto. So clearly, you know, the Chinese may have bought themselves some time with the G20, but not in Washington.
Onona, is that all they did? Buy some time?
Yeah, and I don't think they even intended to do anymore. I don't think they're simply going to succumb to Obama's letter that he wants everybody to look after the U.S. interests. So I think this is buying some time. This is a diplomatic effort at best, and then the issue is going to still have to be dealt with on real structural terms.
Okay, let me ask the former ambassador from Chile to India and South Africa, right?
Yes.
You've been around.
Yes.
Let me ask you about another country in Latin America that, of course, so many people have their eyes on now because they are such an emerging power. Brazil. What do you think their focus is going into the G20?
Well, there are a number of things they are keen on. One of them is President Lula is very keen to keep the stimulus programs going. He thinks there has not really been a turnaround in the world economy, and he is concerned about the deficit hawks and what they are saying, what they are doing. So that's one point. Another point, he is keen to move faster on financial regulation. He thinks there's not been enough movement on that. He is happy to see that there's been some reform in the World Bank, but is keen to see reform in the IMF, which is supposed to be taking place later this year. The IFIs and their situation is, for Brazil, a very important concern. He is also concerned about the regional banks. The IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, took a hit during the financial crisis, and its fund needs to be replenished. So he is very concerned about that. So he has a pretty ambitious agenda.
On the issue of financial regulation, does he have an ally in Canada?
Well, I don't know.
This country seems to be interested in financial regulation, does it not?
They are, if you kind of follow the Canadian model, then the Canadians are quite supportive of that position. But clearly there are differing views on this, the most evident one being this continuing debate on the bank tax or the bank levy, which, as you saw, the UK government in its emergency budget today did in fact impose such a levy. And they said that the French are likely to do so as well.
So thanks for the advice, Mr. Harper and Mr. Flaherty, but no thanks.
Yeah,
the tension is there.
I think there Canada is trying to draw on India's support because India has actually said that we are going to oppose bank tax because we did well through regulation, just as Canada has said. But I think with Brazil there are greater differences with Canada.
Gordon, you want to come in on this?
Well, I think that, you know, if you look around the world, there really is no unanimity on this. And this is really important because, you know, the Toronto G20 is not the first of these meetings. As was pointed out, we've been doing this since November 2008. And if you can't agree on something like a bank tax and you can't agree on the other things, then the question is, well, why are you all meeting in Canada?
Well, to be fair, it does seem like a long time, but in those kinds of informal leadership terms, I don't think it's all that long. And you know, a number of the major kinds of commitments that they made and the tasking that went on in Washington and London will not actually find their way to kind of finalization, if at all, here in Toronto, but much more likely in November in the Seoul G20 meeting.
Is this the difference between how journalists measure time and how international affairs practitioners measure it?
Yeah, I think I would agree that between 2008 and 2009, the time is not, 2010, time is not that long. But if you actually see what the agendas consist of, nobody is prepared to lead in a substantive sense in rocking the boat, in suggesting anything that is going to be a substantial divergence from what has been going on, being discussed over and over again. And in that sense, it seems really long. If you're just trying to build a bridge between different disagreements and have a, you know, a nice photo op.
Well, let me jump into this. It's very easy to disparage the G20 and what it does and what it hasn't done.
It's very easy.
But let me.
That's what he said, Gordon.
Let me tell you one thing. For example, a lot of people were extremely concerned about protectionism in 2008. That is something that was put on the table at the various meetings of the G20. And if you look around, there really hasn't been an upsurge in protectionism around the world over the past year and a half.
Although not due to the G20.
Well, no, I'm not saying it was due to the G20, but it didn't happen, and it was something that was voiced and expressed at the meeting. So, I mean, we should be careful about these judgments.
Well, there were elements of coordination, and it's not complete, and nobody's suggesting it is. And there is now a transition between a kind of crisis committee that they originally formed on, that is in Washington, and you know, most of these guys were staring over the abyss. And it does certainly clarifies the mind when you've got that kind of threat. Now, I think that transition towards a more permanent kind of committee and an effective agenda, I think it's still open. We just simply are not clear whether or not the G20 is going to be very successful.
Okay, let's. A line that I know from the World Cup is there's no I in team, but there is in BRIC, and we haven't gotten to the I in BRIC yet, and that is India. What do you think the Indian government's priorities are heading into this summit?
Well, opposing the bank tax, IMF reforms, but IMF reforms, again, in terms of reforming the voting structure, but I don't think that we have yet come to the point where India will demand deep structural reforms of the IMF, and I really want to see that. And then there is an issue on the side, which is a very important issue for India, is the nuclear deal between China and Pakistan. And there are all sorts of events that are going to happen when Manmohan Singh is here during the G20 with Stephen Harper and his dinner, which is giving only in honor of one leader, who is India's Prime Minister. So these three primarily are India's stated priorities going into the G20.
Okay, Gordon, let me ask you to follow up on that by asking, how has the elevation of the G20 been received in places like Brazil, like India, like China? We now know that the G20, unlike in previous years where it was the G7 or the G8, the G20 is now it. What do they think about that in those three countries?
I think that they think that's a great thing because it's no longer, as someone said, a rich man's club. It's no longer the G7 or the G8, and now you got everybody around the table at the G20, and that certainly elevates the BRIC nations or the Brazil, India, and China. And so, yeah,
the BRICS.
The BRIC nations.
Okay, I think Anona may want to take issue with that.
Yes, I do, because I do think G20 is better than G1 or G2, but you asked a specific question of how it is received in these countries. I think it is received in the same way that it's being received in Canada. People in general, ordinary citizens, are deeply dismayed about the kind of agendas that their leaders will or will not bring or are yet bringing to G20. I mean, there are really global issues of common concern after the crisis. And the expectation is that those are the issues that will come up in the agenda.
I don't mean this as a facetious question, but what other competing institution would the people that you just referred to prefer to see handle the world's problems?
Well, I don't think that the issue is with the institution. I think that the issue is how the leaders take on the issues when they get the seat at the table. The seat at the table is fine, but it's a seat for the leaders, or is it a seat that really represents the concerns of the people of those countries?
Okay.
I think there's a very deep democratic deficit
Yes.
there.
Let me address specifically the question of Brazil. In Brazil, President Lula has very high popularity, sometimes reaching 80%. Part of the reason of his popularity is his foreign policy, which includes a number of things. But one of the things is the G20. And people are really looking forward to Brazil making a difference on the international agenda. So it is very important to ascertain what are the motives behind governments in emerging countries joining the G20. It's not just to sit at the table and feel important. It's to introduce some changes in global governance and deal with the gaps in global governance, which have been the real problem behind the crisis. And that is something that Brazil is certainly determined to do.
I think that's true, although I would suggest that I wrote a piece recently and said the leader on it was China, a part-time leader. And I don't think there's, yes, they like being in the new, wider G20. First of all, I wouldn't discount the G8. I don't think it's gone away yet, and it may not for a number of years. I don't think it's kaput. And secondly, I think there's still, certainly around China, the leadership, great questions. around what it is prepared to kind of take leadership on and what it is perfectly content not to take leadership on, and act in a way which in effect is more like a veto than it is as in effect defining the agenda.
You want to weigh in on that, Gordon?
I think that that's absolutely right. You know, China was going into Toronto. It had really one major objective, which was to make sure that the renminbi was not going to be discussed. This really was the subject of a number of comments from senior Chinese leaders last week. You know, the Chinese would love to have more voting rights at the IMF, and they're certainly going to push for that. But, you know, when it comes to other nations sort of supervising the Chinese economy, you know, that's a non-starter. So I think the veto analogy is absolutely perfect. This is becoming the UN Security Council with all of its strengths and all of its weaknesses, because you now have China, which is going to prevent cooperation on a number of very important issues, such as rebalancing the global economy, which should be the issue number one in Toronto and perhaps the only issue.
Ananya.
Yes, in the communique that came out of the Busan meeting, just the previous meeting of the economic ministers, out of the 9 clauses, there was one, clause 8, where all of the issues of common concern, of ordinary people's concern, were dumped. That was, one was the food security, the other was financial inclusion, and the third was some kind of, I forget now, but at least these two, the small and medium enterprises challenge. All of these 3 very key issues for people in the aftermath of the financial crisis. One clause, very wishy-washy statements, and yes, an SME challenge is supposed to be launched in Toronto. But these are the issues that need to be brought front and center. And I don't understand why, given the kind of mandate the Indian government, for example, enjoyed in the last election, it's a historic mandate on its redistributive common man agenda. Why can't those kinds of issues be pushed more directly in the G20, and that would require 2 things.
I mean, the reality is the agenda is made up by all the leaders, their Sherpas, their personal representatives.
Well, that's the question.
And India represents one.
Yeah,
India represents one,
I
and
understand.
moreover, the Canadian government and the Prime Minister has long touted, I'm defending the Canadian government here, but in any case, the Canadian government said the chief aspect that we are concerned with respect to both G20 and G8 is accountability. And accountability to them meant taking the commitments that were made, G20, Washington, London, Pittsburgh, and trying to see them implemented.
Yeah.
So the agenda, to the extent it is built around those, are about global balances and the framework that was announced in Pittsburgh. And the SME is part of that.
Yeah, but see, but that's my point, that I think India is at a point now that it can push for certain kinds of reform. It got certain things right in the crisis in terms of banking regulation and so on, and this is the time to come and say that we got certain things right and we
But let me get
want to
Jorge's
push some
sense
more
on
things.
this. I think Ananya is saying that there's too much of this is all about photo ops and puffing up your chest because you've got
I didn't quite say that.
I was going to say that's interpretation on
I'm
your
going to read
part.
between I'm going to take a little poetic license and read between the lines.
Liberties
No,
here.
I mean, you tell me if I've got it wrong, but there's not enough of the common person's agenda
Yes,
at the
absolutely.
table at this thing,
Absolutely.
and people are interested in their photo ops and having a seat at the table. How would you convince her that that's not the case, that in fact the eye is on the ball?
Sure. Well, you know, this is a standard comment that is made about summit meetings. It's always made. It's not just the G20. You know, that
Because
it's all
it's
about.
true.
Well, I disagree. I mean, the way you solve problems is by putting heads together and talking to each other and trying to overcome them. That's the way it's done in the professions. It's the way it's done in hospitals and universities. It's the way it's done in global governance. We have these enormous global governance gaps, issues that cannot be addressed unilaterally. They need action. It's in the economy, it's in the environment, it's in pandemics. How are we going to solve them unless we get the heads of the various key countries together and hammer out some agenda? So it seems to me it's quite unfair to keep saying, you know, just photo op and so on. Things are happening.
I said
Things
photo
are,
op. She didn't say it. I said it. But anyway,
Things
okay.
are better. Things are better now. The world economy is not yet out of the woods. It's true, but things do not look like we will have another Great Depression, as some people thought we might have in September '08. So let us give some credit to what has been done.
One more
Yes,
comeback on that. One more
absolutely,
comeback.
because if if we have to see how the G20 contributed to stalling the global crisis, None of those agendas would have gotten on the Global Economic Forum if it wasn't pushed for by the citizens. And I don't think it came simply from the leaders wanting to do good for the world. So here I do see the importance of multilateral structures, you were saying, to solve certain issues. But then I want the leaders who are now at the table to solve the real issues.
To that end, let me read this by a friend of this program, Walter Russell Mead, who's been on a few times. He's a bit maybe too manifest destiny for you, Alan, but anyway, but anyway, on the issue of the BRICS and whether or not they really are serious, responsible, emerging players, Walter says this: emerging is one of the hypocritical weasel words that foreign policy wonks often use to paper over unpleasant or crude realities. Emerging democracies are undemocratic countries where we hope existing trends may lead to greater freedom over time. Emerging powers, similarly, should be understood as countries that aren't yet ready to play a lead role on major issues, but who, given time, may someday take a seat at the high table of world affairs. The endless nattering about emerging powers is particularly misguided. It also leads far too many people to underestimate the clout that the world's true great powers have. American power, for example, is not some fragile flower that will be withered by the first blast of cold air. It rests on extremely durable geographical and cultural foundations, many of the factors that enabled the British to triumph in their wars against France during the 18th century bolster American power today. Okay, let me go to Gordon first because he's in the American capital. We'll let him comment on that, and then we'll get to the table here in Toronto. Go ahead, Gordon. Do you think that's right or wrong, what I just read?
I think that's absolutely right. You know, in our world right now, everyone thinks that the Chinese have the biggest economy and the biggest manufacturing sector and everything like that. But when you really look at the numbers, China is just dwarfed by the United States. The issue for the Obama administration and for Americans in general is what role do we really want to play in the world, and are we willing to exercise our power? Now, the Obama administration has a very different answer than the Bush one. Some people may agree or disagree with it, but if you don't exercise power, you lose it. And that's really, I think, what's happening right now in Washington. And it's not just the G20 and economics, it's all through a wide spectrum of issues. And so while I agree with that statement, there are some very important qualifications that one has to put in connection with it.
Alan?
I think it's a little too imperial for my blood. I don't think that's exactly the way in which the contemporary global governance system is operating. There is a dilemma for the United States. The United States played largely a unilateral role for the previous 8 years. Yes, it became more multilateral towards the end of the second Bush years. But, you know, realistically, countries looked at it and said, you know, this is the way you're acting in largely unilateral ways. And so the Obama administration has really turned on the question of, we'll call multilateralism, but it's still trying to fashion something where there is a flatter hierarchy. It's not just the United States and then everybody else. It is a more collaborative environment in which these countries need to find ways to collaborate. That's not an easy thing to do.
I take your point, but he's saying that, I think he's talking about people like you. He says foreign policy wonks. I'm not sure he had you in mind, but you plead guilty to that. You plead guilty to that.
Yeah, sure.
He says you guys overdo it on this whole business of emerging nations, that these emerging nations are really not prepared to be major players in the world.
Well, I think a learning and education process is underway. It works on both sides. The United States has to learn how to try to move the yardsticks without simply saying, here's the program, here's what we're going to do. And equally, for the others, there has to be a growing sense that they have to take some responsibility. Obama constantly refers to the notion of rights and responsibility. Yes, they have rights, but they also have responsibilities. And the only way multilateralism will work is if all these countries perceive that they have both of those going forward.
Jorge, tell me whether you think that Walter Russell Mead is on target here.
Well, I think that statement might have been considered appropriate. I wouldn't say right, say 10 years ago. But to say it today seems to me is to totally misunderstand what is going on. We have had a big financial crisis that was triggered in Wall Street that affected mostly Europe. The Eurozone is about to implode. Whereas China and India grew right through it, and Latin America, for the first time in 200 years, didn't have a sort of multiplier effect of an international financial crisis, as it always did in the past. So, I mean, what does that tell you? The writing is on the wall. Where are the problems? The problems are in the north. Right now, developing countries make something like 43% of GDP, of the world product. The United States still produces something like 25%, and China only 6%, say. But things are changing. There is a new dynamic, and the action today is in the global south. It seems to me that is a very static view.
Are you going to be the imperialist on our group tonight?
Well, it is static and imperialistic and anachronistic, whatever you want to say. But there is an issue with, whether the U.S. Certainly there are threats to its power, but its will to exercise power. I think it's still, as you said, the learning process is going on. I think it's a slow learning process on the part of the US. Sure. And the way the learning process can be expedited is by the other powers challenging that power. Power never unlearns its power by itself. It's simple logic of power.
And, it is uneven, too. Let's be clear. It is true that Brazil grew potentially this year 7%, but that's the first time it's had that high a level of growth in quite a number of years.
But China and India have been
China
doing 8, 9, 10
China
year after year.
Beyond India by a good 3 to 4%, which cumulatively over quite a long period of time is a lot of differential growth.
In which case, we're down to our last 5 minutes here. Let me ask Gordon, which one of the 3 big countries that we've been talking about tonight do you think is the most likely to be the bridge between the emerging powers and the so-called established powers, if I can put it that way?
Well, that one is easy. That's India by far. China is not a bridge. China is a pole. It's got so many problems, and it's got an economy which is on a knife's edge at this point. Brazil has sort of gotten itself off to the left side, aligning itself with countries like Iran. India, you've got a very strong country, a democracy, one that in 2025 or 2030 is going to be the most populous in the world. If you really want to put your money on a country, you got to say that it's India among all of the ones that we've been talking about tonight, because it has really all the elements in place.
Jorge, which country do you put your money on as the bridge?
Well, India is a country I dearly love. I spent close to 4 years there. And in some ways,
ambassador.
Yes, in some ways I wish what Gordon just said was true. But I'm afraid that that is not the case. India is all the things that have been said, but it is also a highly fragmented country. It is ruled by a coalition of something like 14 parties. It has 28 states, many different views on how to move forward. And that has, until now, been a major problem for projecting forcefully its foreign policy abroad. In Afghanistan, a country of great concern to India, does not have any troops. What does that tell you? It tells you something. So I think that on this particular case, there's a greater chance for Brazil, who is much more able to project its foreign policy in an assertive fashion, as President Lula has shown, than India has.
India or Brazil?
Well, I agree with what he said about India. My only concern with the way you phrased the question is, yes, it does have to be a bridge, but I think India also, given all of the things, also can be a little bit more than a bridge, and that would be my hope. Between India and Brazil, I think there are strong factors favoring Brazil as well, because I don't think just because India has higher growth, it therefore is a greater leader. And I want to also say one thing, that both India and Brazil, growth is extremely unequal. I don't think we should just say that growth, therefore these are great countries, therefore they're going to lead. The inequality is something we didn't get to discuss, but very key point about the global power relations.
Indeed. A minute and a half to go. Alan, what are you looking for at the summit this weekend?
This weekend?
Yeah.
Well, that they can kind of get their way through some of these mutual assessment process and peer review processes without having some difficulty, because as Gordon had said, the reality of others looking at China and measuring its policies, or the United States looking at its policies, criticizing it, potentially criticizing it. I think those are the kinds of things I would worry about, and hopefully they can avoid. What they can do is they can all discuss these their differing policies, seek coordination where they can get it, and move on towards Korea, because Korea is where some of the actual numbers on capital ratios, liquidity ratios, some of the issues related to the global financial crisis need to be finalized, as do some of these numbers on the shares and quotas with respect to the IMF and to the World Bank.
Gotcha.
They're still to be done.
Thank you for putting a bow on it, and I want to thank Gordon Chang from Forbes.com for being there on the line for us in Washington, D.C. Gordon, always great to have you on the program. Thanks so much. On one side of the table here in Toronto, Ananya Mukherjee-Reed from York University, Jorge, Heine, buenas tardes, and thank you for being here tonight from Wilfrid Laurier University, Alexandroff from the Munk School on the other side of the table. Thanks so much, everybody.